Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends. Welcome to the Bruno Kreisky Forum this evening. We have a fantastic guest here and a very important topic. As usually introduced by Robert Misik, Branko Milanović. Thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you. Thank you.
I was a bit hesitating because there are 2 or 3 more issues to mention when we have a very famous economist among us, Branko Milanović, who was born in Belgrade, Serbia, former Yugoslavia, in '53. And as I find out, and it will be sure also a matter of this evening, social inequality, the topic of the talk today, has actually obviously occupied his mind and his research from a very, very early stage on. In 1987, he wrote his PhD on social inequality in former Yugoslavia. Also, we discussed Tito's and Kreisky's relations a little bit before when Branko Milanović arrived. As far as we, to sum it up, this was obviously a very friendly relation, a good relation, especially also with regard to Kreisky's and Tito's cooperation in the context of the Conference on Security Security and Cooperation in Europe, CSCE, now is the OSCE, and I'm also very glad that we have a great expert on these relations here among us, our board member and former diplomat, Dr. Eva Novotny. Thank you also for joining us. So, having said that, let me also, of course, make a bridge to social inequality and visions of justice, which for sure is, first of all, not only an economic topic, but we're glad to have an economist here, but it's as we can see from this very interesting book, it's also, of course, a philosophical, a sociological, a political question, and we are very much aware about these challenges if we look to our own the challenges we see in Europe and also in Austria with regards to how to preserve the social welfare state and democracy, because visions of equality and inequality are, of course, also politically debated, and very often we have to face, in this context, right-wing populism promising equality or whatsoever by actually destroying this democracy and the social welfare state. So there is a broad range of topics related, and I'm really happy and glad to host you here, and I wish you all an interesting evening and then an interesting debate and discussion afterwards. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Sabine Größenhuber, and thank you very much that all of you are here, the friends of the Bruno Kreisky Forum, joining this evening here, and also you on the digital devices who are watching us from home. Welcome to the Kreisky Forum, and again, thank you. Also from my side, welcome to the Kreisky Forum, Branko Milanović. Welcome here.
Thank you very much.
We talked a little bit because we had a common event with the Kreisky Forum and the Arbeiterkammer some years ago. From that time we know, but you are the first time in this house.
First time.
So this is also very necessary that you are here, and we are very glad and honored to have you here. This was also planned as a cooperation of Arbeiterkammer and Kreisky Forum, but the person who was in charge for this cooperation, he left his job, and he's now Minister of Finance. So at the end, it's only an event of the Bruno Kreisky Forum, but we are very glad that he is the Minister of Finance. Branko Milanović is one of the most well-known economists in the world. He was one of the leading economists of the Weltbank. He is teaching as a professor since years now in New York, and so on. And Sabine also said something about his early years, so I don't have to do this. So I will start with the book already. And your book is called Visions of Inequality. For you who don't know the book yet, it's a book about economic thinkers. So it's also especially a book about the history of economic thinking. Right. And so my question would be, I assume you wrote the book because you think all of these thinkers, for them, all of them have something to say to us still now today. What were you very interested in the thinkers to present them now?
Well, first of all, let me thank you very much for coming here, and also to say how much of a pleasure it is for me always to come to Vienna. And of course, we have had a number of events before, including with, of course, Bruno Kreisky Forum. Now, the question that you asked me, it's a very difficult question. I'm not sure if, let me tell you the reality. The reality was that I have read, these are main economic thinkers, and actually let me give you the names so that you would see. The book starts with François Quesnay, who lived before the French Revolution and who is actually considered with Adam Smith the founder of political economy. Then it goes predictably, with Adam Smith, Ricardo, Marx, and then Pareto and Kuznets. And then ends with chapter 7, the last chapter, which actually discusses fairly critically the lack of studies on inequality between 1960 and 1990. The book ends with 1990s. Now, why did I write it? I wrote it, there was no really sort of reason of the instrumental reason to do that. The reason was the following. I've been reading all these writers, actually. I wrote several articles much before on Quesnay, for example, or on Marx. And Marx I've read since I was 19, actually. And then I kept on rereading. And I sort of thought at one point, I really would like to write about them, and I would like to take a different point of view, which actually nobody else has taken, is to look at how they were, interpret rather, how they might have thought about inequality. So the question that was in the very beginning of the book, I explained that, I say, essentially, I'm asking them, as it were, to write an essay where they would tell me what were the forces that determine inequality in their own time and how the inequality would develop. So, you know, it is not, it's a question of interpretation. You know, there is no such a chapter in Marx which says inequality. Actually, we will probably talk about Marx quite a lot, but inequality doesn't play much of a role in Marx. So you have then basically to interpret, and I did interpret, and then actually then you get yourself in disagreement with some other interpretations. But the original title of the book that the publisher didn't use was, to some extent, expressed what I really wanted to do, which is through the lens of inequality. In other words, I look at each of them, including Ricardo, including Adam Smith, through the lens of inequality. So I don't discuss other things. So there is no labor theory of value. And actually I said that in the beginning, you know, I say, no, there is no labor theory of value. I don't discuss, you know, comparative advantage of Ricardo. I discuss what the Ricardian prescriptions would mean for inequality in England, but I don't discuss other parts. So I don't discuss, for example, you know, I discuss division of labor in Smith simply because I need it for inequality, but I don't discuss it maybe for other reasons. So that was a narrow scope of the book. But it is, I have to say, the only book that actually takes that point of view about looking at how key economic thinkers thought about inequality over the last 2 centuries. And as we speak further, I think that I would develop this, and I think you would see, I believe, a certain logic which might not have been even apparent to me in the very beginning, but as I was writing the book, it became clearer.
So, but for the audience, you focus on income inequality and not wealth inequality, and primarily, as far as it's possible, on what are the sources of, what did you see these writers as the sources of inequality, and not really the question if they are pro or con. In some way you have some implications about that, but that's not the prime thing.
Absolutely. First of all, I know that's kind of a little bit boring and too technical, but I really focus on income inequality. That means essentially, and especially when you take the first 4 authors, Quesnay, Smith, Ricardo, and Marx, it essentially means what economists call functional income distribution. It essentially means distribution between capital and labor, and actually in Ricardo and Smith, it is also landlords. So rents, profits, and wages. How would they evolve, and what do they imply for the incomes of such groups? And what do they imply for overall inequality? So that's the focus. There is a little bit about wealth inequality, but not much. And actually, for those who are interested, each chapter starts with an overview of the personality with small details that are not that well known. You know, the fact that, for example, Ricardo's mother actually disowned him because he married a non-Jewish woman. It's not that well known. Or the fact that, of course, that Marx's mother was Dutch, that spoke English, German, fairly elementary. That's not known, you know, and other things. So, but then it goes, the next section always goes, discusses inequality at the time of that writer. And that's the knowledge that we have now, which they didn't have then. You know, we now know English inequality at the time of Marx and Ricardo much better than they knew, because we have all the historical data. So, and then afterwards there is this discussion of each individual author, of their writing. But the structure, as I said, is a little bit about the author himself. And they're only men. That's another, of course, interesting question, why is the only men? And then the next part is about the inequality at their time, and then the discussion of their work.
Maybe I ask you some questions about every one of these writers, and my understanding, what you see as central, which might be a mistake of mine, but maybe I'm right too. Let's start with Quesnay, and also in the aspect, what have they tell us for today, if we sum them up? Let's start with Quesnay. He is maybe not totally well known in the general audience today, but as we know, we owe to him the phrase laissez-faire, laissez-passer. And as I understand the importance with Quesnay, besides that he at first started with political economy and differentiated classes, is that he understood that the goal of economic activity is to produce a surplus, because in a modern society you need some elites, you need some ideologues, you need somebody for the administration, and for that you have to produce an economic surplus. Is that's the central issue of Quesnay?
Yeah, I think the central issue in my perspective of Quesnay, which as I said is in the perspective of inequality, is that he was the first to have defined social classes. Now, social classes play a really key role when we study inequality, and actually one of the critiques towards the end of the book that I have about modern inequality studies is that they totally ignore social class. But obviously early writers basically deal with social classes. That's the building block of inequality. And of course, Quesnay was the first, actually, in his work there are about 12, 14 social classes, and they're really occupations. He's famous for what is called le grand tableau. Many of economists know that actually this is famous zigzags that he did. But there is another work that he did which is called, the first called le tableau économique. The second one is called le grand tableau économique. And there he gives approximate numbers for the average income of these 12 social classes and the average share of their of the class in the population. So basically you have what economists call the social table, and from that social table you can calculate all kinds of inequality measures, according to him, in France around 70-60. Okay. But he was also important for my purposes and actually for Marx. Marx actually has about 200 pages written on Quesnay. Because he was the first one to define the surplus. Now, the surplus is crucial because the question that he asked, why do we have economic activity? And we have economic activity to create a surplus which would maintain a society. And what was also interesting, I will not go into all details, because Quesnay is a very interesting and important writer. He believes that the surplus is only things which are above the normal rate of interest and the subsistence wage. And the surplus is used, as you said, actually, to maintain three classes that he calls jointly les propriétaires. And this is landowners, government, and he was actually a government official. He was a doctor to Madame de Pompadour, so he was in the court, basically, and nobility. Now, the reason, and the clergy. And what are the services that they provide? Nobility or landlords provide land. The government provides justice and protection of property from external aggression or domestic violence. And clergy provides sort of spiritual sustenance. So these are the three groups that receive the surplus. And the economic activity, the objective of the economic activity is the generation of surplus so that, quote unquote, a civilized society can exist. So that's actually what I think is important for Quesnay.
To go to Adam Smith, we can say, it's not really about Adam Smith, but to start with, I would say, if we talk about inequality, we have two issues, usually, to answer. Ethical or moral questions. Is inequality, can we accept it, or is it a scandalon that there is any inequality? And the second question is if there is an inequality in a way functional for prosperity and society. And if we come to Smith, he gave in a way an answer to both, I assume, because he said, he is a leftist in your book, the leftist that said the prosperity of the largest group is decisive for the wealth of society, because that means that the moral answer that a little bit more equality is better than too much inequality is also functional to a society. We wouldn't assume that of Adam Smith, the guy who is the poster boy of the right-wing liberals sometimes.
Yeah, I totally agree. Actually, I don't, we could go on Smith forever, actually. But he's an extremely impressive writer. And actually, I didn't, before this book, have not read, for example, his lectures on jurisprudence, which are lecture notes taken by students, two different students, And they're, of course, the basis of the wealth of theory of moral sentiments and the wealth of nations. But what you said, I have to be very clear on that. There is current opinion among most economists, most of whom have not read Adam Smith at all, but that's the majority opinion. They have opinions even without reading, which is not uncommon. Is the following, is that the wealth of nations is seen as a sort of, as you said, a poster for essentially Chicago School of Economics and free trade, low government intervention, all of that. And according to, that was influenced by Amartya Sen, theory of moral sentiments, because the main the main motivation, main motive in the theory of moral sentiments is empathy, whereas the main motivation of the wealth of nations is self-interest. So then, according to Amartya Sen, this was a much milder book, and leftists, for some reason, then flocked towards the theory of moral sentiments. But I think that approach is entirely wrong, and I explain why. I actually think that the theory of moral sentiments, if you read it carefully, and you actually don't even need it carefully, it sort of jumps at you. It was written when he was in the second, third year of his professorship, and he was a moral philosopher, and he had to be also, he We don't know how religious he was, but he had to pretend to be religious. And it's essentially a theistic work which attempts to justify inequality by appeal to the claim that God has not abandoned the poor people, that God has taken them into account, but that in reality, inequality is not so stark as it seems, and he never says it totally explicitly, but in reality, they would be compensation will come sort of in the other world. So it's really sort of de facto justification for existing inequality, and moreover, when the rich are made fun of, which often they are, it is never actually with questioning of their right to be the rich and to be in power and to sort of rule over the others. But when you go to the wealth of nations, it's an entirely different world. It's the world where the rich are attacked, and actually I intentionally did in the book 2 pages of quotations which go like bullets, the way that the rich acquire wealth. He's, of course, so much against East India Company. He was against Crusades. He was against Pisa, Genoa, Venice, all the trading nations. And he basically goes on and says, the original wealth is acquired through slavery, plunder, stealing, cheating, monopoly, collusion. These are the means. And consequently, the rich are really subjected with the famous statements when he says that the wealthy people never get together, employers never get together except to make a conspiracy against the public. There are all these statements that are overwhelming. Now, what the Chicago School has done, they have pulled out some statements which are, of course, critiques of government, because he doesn't have a critique of the government. But the critique of so-called employers or masters, the word capitalist never appears because he calls it commercial society, is actually overwhelming. So that was my argument for actually saying that The Wealth of Nations is de facto, I think it's actually a social democratic book. It's really a leftist book. Mm-hmm. And let me give you a last point. How many times does the word divinity, God, superior being, and I don't remember the fourth one, appear in the 2 words? In the Theory of Moral Sentiments, it's almost 200 times. In The Wealth of Nations, I think it's 6 times. The Wealth of Nations is a world without God. Mm-hmm. And that's a remarkable difference from the Theory of Moral Sentiments.
The way he ridiculizes the ruling privileged classes is in quotes like, the rule of the privileged society of merchants is probably the worst form of government in any country, and so on. Who doesn't think on Trump or mafia capitalism or something like that? And also this axiom that the prosperity of the largest group is decisive for the wealth of society, this is, as you mentioned, it's a social democratic statement. Yeah. We can also say, if the neoliberals or the neoclassicals, or some of them say that we need inequality because the lower classes have to be kept in misery to motivate them to work, this wouldn't be the idea of Smith.
No, not at all. Actually, as you said, he explicitly says that the welfare or the well-being of the largest class of laborers is absolutely what defines a successful society. And there was a very beautiful quote. I cannot now, well, he writes better than I. He says that society where people who actually feed and clothe us and are paid and live on sort of miserable levels is not a society worth having. And then he actually explicitly, for example, criticizes Portugal and Spain. And he says, what is the worth of the riches of Cadiz and Lisbon if people live beggarly lives there? And finally, which is very important, how should I say, the best country in Adam Smith is the Netherlands, it's Holland. Mm-hmm. And the reason why it is the best is, of course, because it is the richest, but it's for 2 also other additional reasons. One is the wages are the highest in the Netherlands, and actually that was true, from contemporary data that we have now, their wages were the highest. And other than the wages in the US in the colonies, they were even higher, but I leave the colony now. Okay, let me leave the colonies now for a minute. Okay, so the Netherlands, because the wages are high and because rate of interest, the rate of profit is low. That's very important. He says only societies which are prosperous and where there is lots of capital have low rate of interest. And of course, that's important then for when I start putting together inequality in a more advanced society according to Smith. He actually argues, same as Marx later, that they would be, as society advances, the rate of return of the rate of profit would go down because simply there is more capital, and that's what defines a prosperous society. And actually, just to say one more thing of that, he actually has a moralistic argument for that, because he says it's important that the person should not be allowed to live basically on property income, so that he or she should need to work. So there are two arguments against high rate of interest. That high rate of interest, high rate of profit is only high in countries where property is insecure. He takes, for example, Hindustan, where people have to hide money in the ground. So then rate of interest is high because it's very uncertain, the property is uncertain, and the rate of interest should not be high for the moral or ethical reasons that people need to work.
Mm-hmm. I go on to Ricardo. Most of us would know him as the economist who advocates free trade, comparative advantages you mentioned already. Yeah. And you say the central element with Ricardo is the goal to increase production. I understand it totally from the way as you argue and you present the argument of Ricardo. So, for example, if there are tariffs, grain must be grown on poorer soil. That this raises the prices of the grain. As a result, wages has to rise for the workers so that they do not starve. This reduces industrial profit and slows growth.
Exactly.
So this is also very logical. It sounds very logical, and my question would be, does this introduces this kind of a little bit cold-heartedness in the economic thinking, that the one thing is what is morally good, or what we would answer is with a sentiment of compassion, but effectiveness is the goal?
Yes, Ricardo, I would say, yes, I think Ricardo, I actually have a sentence that people have noticed. I think there are shades of the 5-year plan in Ricardo. Ricardo, well, partly because of his background. Ricardo was a trader, as people know. It was a stock jobber. And the principles were written because of his reading of Adam Smith and critique and all that. And the model that you said is extremely simple. But that model is driven with one objective, and this is growth. Mm-hmm. It's actually, and for Ricardo, in order to have growth, you have to have high profits, because these profits are reinvested, and that maintains growth. So, the irony is actually that if capitalism would really have to have one hero, that hero is not Adam Smith, that hero is David Ricardo. Mm-hmm. It's really the role of capitalists is absolutely crucial. It's a little bit like entrepreneur in Schumpeter. Without that capitalist, you don't have growth. Consequently, the society become stationary or stagnant, and they disappear. But Ricardo doesn't. In some sense, he has cold-heartedness, but in the other way, no. Because it is so much driven, that's actually what Marx wrote, it is so much driven by this objective of growth that Marx said, actually, that Ricardo does it, Marx says it in French, with bonne foi. And he does it with bonne foi because Marx says if Ricardo believed that workers had to be the main agents to deliver growth, he would be for workers. So it was not capitalism as a class. It was capitalists as producer, or actually the conduit toward wealth. Mm-hmm. So that was interesting, Ricardo, but what I want to say is actually just to complete that for my own purposes of inequality. What's interesting is, and that was actually not noticed before, is that he proposes that particular solution, of course, increased growth in the case of, in the case that you do not grow grain in England but import it, because profits would be higher and then you would grow more. But when you, what it means also, and people forget about that, is that in terms of inequality, that means a loss for the top class, which are landlords, the increase for the middle class, which is capitalists, and unchanged position of workers. So if you look at implication for inequality, Ricardo is proposing a lower inequality. And if you look at the examples that he has numerical examples, and you look at Gini coefficient in the examples with corn laws and without corn laws. Without corn laws, Gini is lower. So Ricardo proposes two things to you: higher growth and lower inequality. It's very interesting. It's actually, he's basically saying Okun law, what we call later, doesn't exist. The two things are not in Ricardo a trade-off. You have to have lower inequality, which means capitalists have to be richer compared to the landlords in order to have higher growth. So it has an inequality component in it.
And also, if it wouldn't have, one could say he is for higher growth. That means, if it would work that way, that it raises the position of everybody. And one could say, also for the poor, it is better to raise their absolute position, and it's not so important for them to raise their relative position in relation to somebody other, or?
It's very tricky because in Ricardo's model, because it's a very, very bare model. It's really mathematical models said in words. The implicit assumption, well, the no more the explicit assumption is that the wages are a subsistence. That actually makes the model very easy to work with. And I'm not 100% sure that Ricardo ever really envisaged a possibility that the wages would be above subsistence. We will come to subsistence in Marx, which I think is much more, how should I say, much richer, much more complex. But Ricardo, for the needs of his model, essentially says the wages are at subsistence. And there are many interesting parts of Ricardo. He was, for example, against the poor laws, you know, but you cannot, he as a person, I think, was a person of outstanding moral qualities. But his work was, as I was explaining before, you know, it's a work where actually was driven by the need for growth. And the fact that inequality went down, would go down, and actually did go down with corn laws. It's actually what we know now. There was a paper published 5 years ago that actually shows that inequality in England did go down, as Ricardo implied, with the abolition of corn laws and the reduction of rents and landlords' incomes.
Also, the concept of comparative advantages is because it shows then there will be growth better for both. At least it would be effective for both sides. But you had one sentence in your book or in these pages about Ricardo where you said, yes, but if you have trade and if you are dependent on trade if you are dependent on imports, then you need a fleet. At least if you are England, but also if you are France. And the question raised in my head, does trade lead to armament?
Well, that's a very pertinent question today.
Yes, that was the reason I asked it, because if we talk about the energy crisis and the oil crisis and the gas crisis, we are very near to this question.
Towards the end of the chapter, as you said, I use an idea, well, actually I described a book. Actually, it was a book by Avner Offer, which is, I think, very influential. At least I was very influenced. I read it like 15 years before writing this book. So, it's, you know, as I was writing about Ricardo, of course, I was drawing on my readings over 40 years. And what Avner Offer says, it was called the agricultural explanation for World War I. is the following, and that actually goes directly to Ricardo. Once you, you're England, suppose, and once you need your food from abroad because it is for all the reasons that we just mentioned, it makes no sense for you to produce food locally. You have to be sure that the supplies would come. And you have to be sure that particularly at the time of war, because if the supply of food doesn't come, nobody's going to fight for you. And actually we know the World War I at the end with the blockade, German blockade, that's how the war ended. Then that means that you have to have a fleet. So the implication of Ricardo's view was that England or Great Britain had to rule the waves. So this is the military implication of an economic policy. And of course that leads to what is called the armed trade. It means essentially the trade is seen not an activity where you basically voluntarily sell and buy, it can exist only if there is underpinning, which is military. And I have to say that most recently I actually talk quite frequently about a book by a French economic historian, Oren. He published a book just now, and it's called, the subtitle is Le capitalisme des finitudes. It's really great. It's actually of finitude, and capitalism which has sort of limits. And then he talks about different periods which are characterized by armed trade, by mercantilism, by essentially military control of the sources, raw materials, and periods which are much more optimistic, where people believe that actually voluntary trade is the way to go. And I think that book and it goes very well. I think if I had written my book now, I would certainly have continued quoting him because it actually goes very well with the implication of what Ricardo was saying.
Mm-hmm. Let's go to Marx. Let's switch to Marx, who is the founding father of the left, the founding father in a way also of social democratic parties, with all difficulties we have to mention. But when social democratic parties now would say we are fighting for more equality and more against injustice, this would not be the idea of Marx, because he would have said that income inequality is a consequence of class society, and the capitalist economy cannot be resolved and the class capitalist economy, and it cannot be resolved within it, or not even addressed. So in a way, he was not really interested in it. His answer would be the elimination of class rule, not only for moral reasons, but also for reasons of effectiveness, because his idea was that capitalism comes to the boundaries of his effectiveness. So what's with equality in Marx?
You know, I say this in the book. There are two different views, you know. There are some people who argue that inequality was, from the ethical perspective, there was a guy who wrote actually the same time a book similar to mine from the political philosophy angle. Mm-hmm. And of course the choice of authors is very different, because he starts with Aristotle, Plato, also the Gospels, and then goes you know, all the way to to Marx. And we have Smith and Marx together, but not other. For example, I don't have Rousseau, and he has Rousseau, you know, and so on. But he actually argues that it's not totally unpersuasive, but he argues that for Marx, inequality was an important concept for moral reasons, and it gets more complicated, but let me leave it at that. I believe, as you said, actually, I don't need to repeat it, I believe that actually inequality plays almost no role in Marx, and there are sort of explicit statements, particularly in the critique of the Gotha program, both in his letters and Engels, more explicitly by Engels, where he says, you know, this is sort of a I think it's Proudhonist position that we are and Lassalle's, actually, Lassalle's position that we are interested in reducing inequality in the capitalist society. This is not our objective. Our objective is abolition of classes, period. And after the abolition of classes, and that's where Marx goes into this famous discussion of the difference between socialism and capitalism, and, you know, sort of compensation according to the amount of work done, and then or compensation according to needs. That's when Engels says, and then Marx as well, say, okay, that's when we will have to start thinking about inequality. And there is a very nice statement by Engels. He says, inequality would always exist. There will be inequality between people who live in cities and people who live in the countryside. There will be inequality between people who live in sort of high mountains and people who live in the valleys. So I think that for Marx and the word inequality really it doesn't appear as such. Now, the number of chapters in Capital Volume 1 have to do with poverty and mistreatment and, of course, a huge exploitation in technical terms, Marxist terms, and even in terms of actual fact that you had to work 14 hours a day. So that part, yes, is present there, but it's presented as the effect of capitalism on labor, including female labor, children, and so on. But inequality as such under capitalist regime is not, it would not be an objective. Let me just put the last one. Shlomo Avineri, who has actually two excellent books on Marx social thought, he actually very well explains that, in my opinion. He says, for Marx, all the social activities, including, Social Democratic Party and trade unions and all that, were important as a socialization of the workers and taking consciousness of their role and demands for better wages were simply the need for better consciousness of our own power, but it is not the ultimate objective. So I'm not sure if it was very clear, but the wage increase is not the ultimate objective. The wage increase is an objective for the struggle, which through common sort of shared common experience would lead to the abolition of capitalism. And Avineri does it, I think, very well, and in my opinion, quite persuasive.
For political reasons, because it makes the class stronger, and for economic reasons, because it reduces the rate of profit to zero. One point you make, which is very interesting, because we usually would assume, because we all know these quotes from Marx, these ideas that there is a centralization of all this concentration of a fantastic wealth on the one side and the concentration of deep misery on the other side, that Marx did predict in a way or analyze. He saw it in his time and he predicted that for the next time, the impoverishment of the working class. And you say these ideas that Marx was the theorist had a real bad prediction, what we call the imization theory. This is wrong.
I think it is wrong, and actually, although it's not entirely wrong, because you can make an argument that people have made, that the argument is the following. It was made originally by Marxists, particularly by Grossman, because they were expecting revolution every day, and they actually wanted to argue that Marx expected the position of the working class to get worse. But then nowadays it is really made by the right-wing people, because they say, look, Marx said that there would be immiseration of labor, and actually it never happened, so he must be wrong on everything. But in reality, if you read Marx, actually the statement of immiseration happened only 2 or 3 times. And the first one is very famous in the Capitalist Manifesto, but one has to remember, it's written by a 29-year-old man who has actually...
Within one night or 2 nights.
Yes, a couple of days, which is a beautifully written stuff, but he didn't even study political economy. And then the other 1 or 2 statements appear in Capital, but they're really sort of programmatic and political. But the logic of wages is really against that, and of the conception of Marx. First, Marx says that wage has 2 components, physiological and historical. The historical clearly depends on the level of development. So the richer country would have a higher wage. Not only that, he actually gives you the table, which is taken from, I forgot the name, a German author, which shows the real wage in different societies. So England is at the top, Austria and Germany next. I think France may be the number 2, then Austria, Germany number 3, Russia number 4 or 5. So clearly, development means higher wage. And finally, very important point, all categories in Marx are historical. Tools become capital under capitalism. Goods become commodities under capitalism. Otherwise, they are just goods. And likewise, there is really almost, and wants, actually needs, are totally historically determined. So we have a need today for the cell phone because cell phones exist. But 50 years ago or 20 years ago, we didn't have that need. So the need itself is historical. And then wage has to be a historical category because it would be totally anti-Marxist to believe that there's such an important category is not historical. If the wage is historical, then the historical element in the wage determination that I mentioned before is important. And that's why I actually argue that it is consistent with Marx to believe that there will be an increase in real wage as society or capitalist society becomes richer. And finally, to conclude, Marx actually, of course, I take a position which many people did too, that there was a within Marx of tendency of the rate of profit to decline. So if you put these two together, well, what do you get actually? Increase in real wage, tendency of the rate of profit to decline. You get actually lower inequality. Now, I'm not so simplistic because there are countervailing forces, the reserve army of labor, as you were mentioned, concentration of capital ownership in a fewer hands that Marx definitely mentions and claims. These are the countervailing forces. But I think that one can make a very strong argument that Marx could envisage a capitalist society, certainly with increasing real wage, and decline in equality. But, and I have to say that's a very important but with a lower labor share. In other words, real wage up, but the share of workers, or actually of labor, in total value added less. It's very similar actually to Piketty in some sense. Piketty, I mean, they did the same thing. It's actually, the key element is the decline in labor share. And that's actually what we see in all countries. I'm sure in Austria as well. Over the last 30 years, the labor share has gone down and real wage has gone up. And I think that's actually what you have in Marx.
I wonder if we can discuss together also Smith when we said the wealth of a nation is for the wealth of the nation it's central that the lowest classes are raised, and Marx who said that the capitalist crisis are overproduction crisis, which means that they are under consumption crisis. So if the lower classes could consume, the crisis would not happen. And we could also, for example, connect that to Keynes, which you don't spend in chapter 2, who said that who would be in favor of everything that raises aggregate demand. Would this be a smart idea from me, or too simplistic?
No, it is a good idea. I mean, I don't want to go, this would actually take us, well, I can go, but I think that Marx's opinion on underconsumptionism, or actually crisis being created due to underconsumption, I think it's contradictory. And I think Ernest Mandel is right that you have quotes that are going two directions. You have quotes where actually he says that underconsumption of the workers is one of the reasons for the crisis. But then you have really very interesting statement in volume 3, a long statement, where he says, but then why is that the wages are always at the peak before the crisis? So if the wages are at the peak before the crisis, then underconsumptionism cannot be the root cause of the crisis. So I think that actually what now they're going in a different direction. I didn't discuss this in the book except in a footnote. What Mandel says, the real reason for the crisis, according to him in Marx, which I think is true, is disproportional development between so-called departments 1 and 2. So it's not really underconsumptionism. But maybe I can say something why I didn't include Keynes.
Sorry?
Can I say that why I didn't include Keynes?
Yeah, for sure. That's
I know people would like that.
This is an important question. Why didn't you include Keynes?
Yeah, I thought of that quite a lot, and I was thinking who would be number 7, and actually I'll give you some other names that I decided not to include, but that I was considering. Keynes, no, for the following reason. Keynes, Keynes could have discussed inequality, but he didn't want. And I think he didn't want, and actually it is, I think, clear.
But Marx didn't either, well?
No, Marx didn't either, yes. That's true. That's a good point. But I think Keynes didn't want, but Marx thought it doesn't really matter for capitalist society. But Keynes didn't want because I think it was obvious that he could have. When he introduced his declining marginal propensity to consume, obvious way to increase aggregate demand is that you take from rich people who don't consume that and give it to poor people who are going to consume. And that's an open door. But he didn't want to go through that open door, as you see that in the last 2 chapters of the general theory, because he thought that all this underconsumptionist stuff, and he puts Marx among them, is sort of the, what is this called, underworld of economics. So he thought this is not real straight economics, and if I do this underconsumptionist stuff, they would classify my book in one direction, and in some sense, politically, it was better for him to use government spending as a way to compensate rather than to redistribute. That's what I think.
Here I have a question, because I thought about, as I read that, when he would have implicated that or introduced this to this work, he would have seen as a crazy leftist. Yeah?
Yes.
But he introduced in his work a strong state that should invest and, in a way, control the economic life. In a time of Soviet Union, he's a crazy leftist with this theory too.
I mean, that's a matter of judgment. I cannot tell. We cannot tell what Keynes thought, but I think it is clear, and even when you read, it is clear that he could have gone for a distribution. It's kind of obvious. But I think he didn't want, as I was saying before, because he didn't like Hobson. And Hobson was really the primary underconsumptionist. And of course, as you know, Hobson theory then was taken by Rosa Luxemburg and Lenin. So I think that for political reasons, he decided that it was better for him to go with large government spending, despite the fact that, of course, it could be seen as sort of proto-communist, than to go with distribution. But we don't know, really. But nevertheless, it is true that inequality does not play much of a role in Keynes, although technically it does through MPC. But I don't know. Yeah, I thought of Keynes, but I said what I could have said about Keynes would be like on 5 pages, really, because the role, I basically would have said what I said now, and actually wrote afterwards a Substack and all of that, but not much. So that was, I decided not to include Keynes.
I have to skip for time reasons, Pareto and Kuznets, but you should also read the book, so it's a good idea to skip it. And also the last question about the last chapter about the crisis of inequality studies in the 70s, to come with our last minutes to our contemporary situation, because we also were in the contemporary situation. I have the feeling, because we talked about what these economic thinkers can tell us for today. I assume, it's my impression that we talked about this a little bit, because we have now also a time of raising inequality, at least within nations and not between nations. So that was the point of your last big book, or this. One of your last big books, but we would assume that our economic crisis, our political crisis, also the growth that isn't so strong anymore, has to do with inequality because of a gap of consumption. Isn't that a point?
You know, the book itself does not really address the current situation. The
last 10 pages with Piketty.
Yeah, well, they address it in terms of the work that is done on inequality. And of course, that long chapter 7, which is called The Eclipse, is very critical of neoclassical economics, because they have totally ignored class. Classes disappeared, and they actually claim that everybody is basically agent, and they claim even representative agents, which means that by definition, if you have representative agent, all heterogeneity, which is the essence of inequality, is kind of disappears. You know, if we are all here just to have one person as a representative agent, well, there is no heterogeneity. The Gini is zero by assumption. So I see the decline of inequality studies prior to 2015 First, as a result of the Cold War, because there was clearly an attempt, particularly in the US, very strong attempt, to claim that the US is not a class society. So if the Soviet Union is not class society, we are not class society either. End of story. We actually do not have classes. Secondly, the revolution of economics, which led to this representative agent, led to total disregard of inequality, and actually I gave a number of examples. You know, people don't even look at that, they forget about that. Like most famous textbooks, like Samuelson, there is no discussion of inequality. There is no Gini coefficient in that book until the penultimate chapter when he talks about development economics. So inequality does not exist in advanced capitalism.
Not only in economic thinking, also in the sociological thinking. Some famous German concepts were that we are a nivellierte Mittelschichtsgesellschaft. How to translate this? A homogeneous middle-class society. Yeah? And people believe that.
No, I think there were actually political reasons. There were endogenous evolution within economics, with general equilibrium, with endowments, which means endowment of capital, which Adam Smith so much criticized as Marx also, with the primitive accumulation. It becomes no longer an object of study. You bring your capital, I bring my capital. If I stole all my capital and killed somebody, it doesn't matter. I'm bringing capital to the market. Market determines prices and I will get the price. End of story. So I do that, but you know, the book does not, it's not a book that is actually dealing with how should we deal with inequality today. That is a different book and different papers, but it actually ends with the study of inequality now, where I actually see great improvements. Of course, Piketty is responsible for quite a lot of that. I mean, in a good sense, you know, because he brought inequality back. Tony Atkinson did actually in the latter part of his life that as well. And basically, we also now see work on global inequality, which is an entirely new concept. Not because I've done it, but it's a new concept. You know, many things which are, it's like going from two-dimensional to three-dimensional world. And I see also very good developments, extraordinarily good developments in historical work on inequality in 19th and 18th century and even earlier. We now learn really about history of ourselves. Because we learned how unequal societies were and why they were unequal and what were the social classes. We have now work on the Aztec Empire, we have on Byzantium, on Roman Empire, Ottoman Empire. We have empirical work. And I think this is a huge development in the last probably like 30 years. And that's what makes me optimistic for the studies of inequality.
The last question, because it's also about the study of inequality, but also probably about the state we are in, is the central thing, do I understand it right, that the central thing with Piketty is not only the monumentality of his work, but also these two findings or concepts that capital income is always higher than growth, this famous formula, R is bigger than G, and the second centrality that people today with large have on the one side, rich people, the global upper class, they have a lot of financial and other assets and wealth on the one hand, and they have also income from fantastic labor income. That the strongest part of our new inequality is that this class has income from capital income, but labor income in a fantastic way?
Yes, actually that second part is what I also, in my more recent work, call homoplutia. And that homoplutia is obviously neologism, Greek neologism. You know, who was actually liked very much Greek neologism that I learned is Quesnay, actually. Even physiocratic, it's a neologism that he created. It's a rule of nature, actually, to translate. That's an important thing. It's actually basically homoplutia means that you have in the top 10% nowadays in advanced economies, you have about 1/3 of the people there who are among the richest capitalists and also the same people, richest workers, because they have very high salaries. But that development really would have surprised Marx. This is one of the developments that I believe Marx would have been very surprised, and he would not believe that capitalism would generate a situation such that actually the top would not be just capitalists, they would be both capitalists and workers. The contribution of Piketty, just to say that, I think is tremendous, and that contribution comes from his two things. Reintroduction of capital income, because really capital income was really put under the carpet, under the, you know, Tony Atkinson, as I said, towards the end of his life, brought capital back, and Piketty did it. And on top of that, he brought politics back. And I think in particular of his earlier book, which is actually High Incomes in France, which is very political, actually. And, you know, discussing inequality simply just as numbers without discussing politics, without discussing strikes, without discussing political parties, coalitions, foreign policy, it really makes no sense. And I think the contribution of Piketty was actually to bring two things back: politics and capital.
And the narrative, as you said.
And the narrative, yes.
A good economist also has to have a narrative. That is one sentence you have nearly in every chapter, or in the first chapter, and then we see it in this book with these famous economists you write about. Thank you very much, Branko Milanović, to talk with me about your book Visionen der Ungleichheit. Jetzt sage ich es mal im deutschen Titel. Ich kann es nur sehr empfehlen. I can recommend it very much, and I can also say that it's also it's the book of an economist, but it's also readable for interested laymen. So everybody who tries it will understand this book. A wonderful book, a wonderful talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Branko,
Thanks a lot for
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.